Ah yes, as requested by the community, we're testing the AMD RX 580 8GB, which was released in 2017, so let's see if this GPU is still relevant in 2025, especially when it can be found easily for 50 euros on a used marketplace. Or is it time to send that GPU to the graveyard? But yeah, let me tell you, this thing is a fighter. Starting off with some light esports titles, the RX 580 is surprisingly capable, like holding its ground with high frame rates in most popular esports titles. Because for example, in Fortnite, on 1080p low, this thing delivers an excellent 137 FPS on average. Definitely enough, I think, for sweaty competitive players. And I mean, no one is going to be playing on epic settings, but just for fun, I tried it out and we got 45-ish FPS on 1080p and 30 on 1440p. But at least it was also capable on 1440p low, because we got an average of 124 FPS. Basically, you can play Fortnite with this card just fine, no matter what resolution you're on, just, yeah, set the settings a bit lower. Next up, we got surprisingly good results on Apex Legends. Like on 1080p low, it's hitting 110 FPS, and on 1080p high, it didn't change that much, indicating a possible CPU bottleneck maybe? I don't know, but I intentionally paired this thing with a Ryzen 5 5500 just because I think that budget gamers are going to use a similar CPU or an even weaker one. And back to 1440p, it was also very solid with just shy of 0.1 FPS to 100 and 83 on high settings. Now on to Valorant, where this thing manages to shine with over 200 FPS on 1080p low. I'm just pretty sure that if we paired it with a faster CPU, we could get probably even more FPS. Although it sort of falls apart on 1080p high though, because we got our FPS cut in half to around 90, so I'd say that low settings is where you should stay. But then on 1440p low, it is once again strong with over 150 FPS, but then you switch to high and yeah, it is still playable with like 75 FPS on average, but yeah, realistically speaking, low settings or medium settings is the best. Let's talk about PUBG, but let's not question the footage provided, okay? Anyways, on 1080p low, the RX 580 is absolutely beasting, and the beasting continues on 1080p high because it only dips to 90, and at 1440p low, it is still holding strong with 77 FPS on average, but when cranked up to high, yeah, it sort of drops to 64, and at this point, I wouldn't call that gameplay experience that great. Now, let's check out CS2, and on 1080p low, the RX 580 pulls 207 FPS with 1% lows over 100 FPS, so this game is running like it's powered by rocket fuel, like relatively speaking, of course. But on 1080p high, the frame rate gets cut in half, so still enough to shoot some people, like to make your Russian and Polish teammates proud, but yeah, not the best experience. And on 1440p low, it still maintains 190 FPS, which is great, but 1440p high, it takes quite a big hit. Starting off with Stalker 2 at 1440p high, and obviously the RX 580 is gasping for air, running at just 22 FPS with 1% low sitting comfortably at 0.3. Yeah, this is worse than PowerPoint presentation at this point. But moving down to 1440p, it is significantly better with like Xbox 360 level FPS with 1% lows on 25.4, which means that we didn't get any more micro stutters. Although dropping once again to 1080p high, the RX 580 is still struggling real bad with an average of 31. So finally, on 1080p low with 33% FSR 3.1 resolution, we can finally get some decent numbers by making the game look like it was made in the last century. Yay. Okay, now on to Forza Horizon 5, and on 1080p low, we got an average of 85.7, but we're here more interested about its limits, right? So on ultra settings, it drops to 52.8, and on 1440p low, it sort of pushes over 60, but on ultra, it goes down to Xbox 360 levels once again. But I'm saying this not in a bad way, because I feel that especially in this game, you should actually sacrifice some frames for higher graphics, just because at even around 40 FPS, the game feels kinda smooth. Moving on to Marvel Rivals, and I think I started at the wrong end, because on 1440p ultra, it's Yeah, no, it's terrible with only 16.4 FPS. I feel kinda sick playing this, but dropping to 1440p low, it improves a bit, I guess, to 28 when keeping the FSR on quality, but at the end of the day, it's still like a sloth trying to run a race. So on 1080p Ultra, yeah, the performance does not get any better with 20 FPS. So realistically, what we're left with is, of course, 1080p low, and the FSR gods come in to save the day, pushing it to 58 FPS. So yeah, FSR is the real hero here, keeping my frames and my sanity in place. Talking about Cyberpunk 2077. Yeah, on 1440p high, it was hard for our machine to handle with 30 FPS on average. Moving on to 1440p low, it only increased slightly, but Cyberpunk is one of those games where for some reason there's a huge gap in FPS when switching between 1080p and 1440p, so on 1080p high, it was actually smooth going over 60. Okay, now it's time to talk about another PowerPoint called Black Myth Wukong, because on 1440p, I'll be honest, like the experience is pretty miserable, because like on high settings we get only 14 FPS and on low settings we got 21, so not much better. And what about 1080p? Well, it's also pretty bad. Like on high settings we get 18 FPS, so the last resort for us is 1080p low. So here we got a tiny bit more playable 33 FPS with 1% lows of 25, but this is one of those situations where natively it's just too weak. So the only way to play Wukong comfortably, you'd have to use like 50% FSR resolution and maybe even frame generation. And then there's this whole thing that you cannot launch Indiana Jones because no RTX, unfortunately, yeah. But basically, to wrap it up, I think it's priced very fairly in a used market, and the RX 580 definitely delivers in esports gaming, performing really well on 1080p low settings and doing surprisingly well even on 1440p low, but that's only in esports, because as you saw on AAA games, it sorta struggles. And after testing everything, now I'm just thinking, maybe after all, I should retest it later in the future, comparing it to like some budget Nvidia GPU, and especially pairing it with a more powerful processor such as 7600 Ryzen, because some games in the 1660s case we've tested a couple of videos back performed much better solely due to the CPU. So yeah, I think I have some unfinished business with this card. Thank you very much for watching. Cheap bastard out.